No matter your politics, left or right, Labour or Conservative, Green or Reform, Remain or Leave, I think we can all conclusively agree that Brexit was shit.
3 years ago, I committed to the British people that I would renegotiate our position in the European Union and hold an in-out referendum. Now I am delivering on that commitment. On Monday, I will commence the process set out under our Referendum Act, and I will go to Parliament and propose that the British people decide our future in Europe.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms.
The people of this country have had enough of experts.
From organisations.
If we take back control on June the 23rd, we can also get rid of so much of the pointless rules and regulations that are holding back this country. It is absurd that we are told that you cannot sell bananas in bunches of more than 2 or 3 bananas. You cannot sell bananas with abnormal curvature of the fingers.
Yes, it's Admiral Farage and his flotilla of fishing folk who are totally fished off with the European Union. But, shiver me timbers, it's Captain Bob Geldof and the Remain crew, taking no prisoners among the Brexiteers.
May I respond to that? Lie off your bus. May I respond to that?
At 10 o'clock, the polling stations close after weeks, months, years of argument. And we'll have the answer to the question that's haunted British politics for so long. Do we want to be in or out of the EU?
With more than half the votes counted in the UK's referendum on the EU, it's looking increasingly possible that the Leave camp has built up a clear lead.
We've left behind, with this result, we've left behind a failing political union. We've given ourselves the chance to rejoin the world in a 21st century global economy.
But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
So I am today announcing that I will resign as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
Let's get Brexit done on October the 31st.
Whether it was an idea that was never meant to work to begin with, or that it had good intentions that was executed wrong, the economic and social impacts of Brexit on the United Kingdom have been undeniably awful. Due to the trade deal received, businesses have to fill out much more complicated paperwork for EU shipping, meaning that goods exports are on the downtrend. Net migration from non-EU countries and British overseas territories have risen, whilst EU migration has decreased, despite assurances from the Leave campaign that net migration would decrease as a result of leaving the EU's open border policy. Investment in Britain's on the low, and the Office of Budget Responsibility suggests that long-run productivity will decrease by 4%. And I'd argue, most importantly, families and friends have been torn apart by debates over Remain or Leave. Those who voted Leave in 2016 were viewed as racist, whilst those who voted Remain were seen as treasonous to Britain. Naturally, with a complicated issue like this, many tend to look for a finger to point at, someone to blame. Unfortunately, many people want you to point the finger of blame at migrants. But it obviously isn't their fault why Brexit turned out to be so awful. Was it the Remain campaign and many of their incessant efforts to prevent even a soft Brexit? Or was it the Leave campaign and the lies told to British people offered the benefit of only themselves? Here, I intend to find the culprit for Brexit, one of the greatest fuck-ups in Britain's history. Of course, the idea of leaving the European Union did not just spring out of the blue in 2016. It has always been something heavily debated in British politics, dating back to at least the 1990s. Alan Sked, a former member of the Liberal Party and stood in a parliamentary election for them in 1970, founded the United Kingdom Independence Party, more commonly abbreviated as UKIP, in 1991. This has come shortly after Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had been forced into resigning after her famous no, no, no statement around European integration.
So of course we are differing. Of course the chairman or the president of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at a press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.
Despite being initially a backer for Britain joining the European Economic Community, the precursor to the EU in 1975, she slowly became more Eurosceptic as her tenure in office continued. In the largely pro-EU Conservative Party at the time, this was seen as unacceptable, especially to the incredibly pro-EU Geoffrey Howe, her Deputy Prime Minister, who resigned only 2 days later.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that both the Chancellor and the Governor are cricketing enthusiasts, so I hope there's no monopoly of cricketing metaphors. It's rather like sending your opening batsman to the crease, only for them to find, the moment the first balls are bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
She was replaced by her Chancellor of the Exchequer and Foreign Secretary, John Major, in a brutal Tory leadership election in which she withdrew from the second round of voting. Believing the EU had gone beyond its powers of just being a common market free trading zone and had become, quote, undemocratic and a waste of money, end quote, Sked founded the Anti-Federalist League, which later evolved into UKIP. Unlike how UKIP, its members and supporters view today, Sked was a centre-left politician, who explicitly stated on multiple occasions that the party was not founded on immigration issues, something that the party would slowly evolve almost exclusively into. Under Sked's leadership, UKIP ran in the 1992 and 1997 general elections. Despite not gaining any seats out of the 17 and 194 seats stood for in 1992 and 1997 respectively, they did receive a large number of votes, with over 100,000 people voting in 1997. However, in 1997, Sked stood down as party leader to devote himself to pursuing a career in academics. Before he left, he expelled 3 members from the party for organising a public convention in which they discussed why UKIP did not make any victories in the 1997 election. After a long and arduous legal battle, these 3 party members were eventually reinstated once UKIP ran out of funds for their council. One of these members, who was temporarily expelled, was Nigel Farage.
We should accept some refugees, and in particular, I'm thinking about the Christian communities, and the reason I say that is that in all these countries where, just 10 years ago, Christian communities could live and work and worship, and it's now becoming an area where there's almost nowhere for them to go.
But we never said to the Jews, and after all, it's 70 years after Belsen was liberated, we never said to them, we'd prefer to take Christians, but we'll take you.
Well, no, because they were the people under assault. They were the people, clearly, who had nowhere to go. They were the people whose lives were being directly threatened.
Suicide bombers have attacked 2 mosques in the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, killing at least 126 people and wounding scores more.
Farage, one of the founding members of UKIP, was one of the largest anti-immigration voices of the party, and was one of the first 3 UKIP members elected to the European Parliament in 1999, after a change to the rules that made it easier for parties to gain seats. After this, UKIP became, functionally, an EU Parliament protest vote. By 2006, Farage was eventually elected as leader of UKIP and tried to challenge the incumbent Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, for his seat in the 2010 general election. He failed, but managed to win a second leadership election for UKIP that same year, having resigned as leader to stand for Parliament. Over his tenure as leader of UKIP, Farage shifted the reasons for wanting to leave the EU away from an overstretch of power and more towards an anti-immigration stance. Most notably, he opposed the EU's open border policy called the Schengen area. What it allowed was for citizens of EU nations, as well as Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland and Iceland, to cross freely between each other's borders without border checks. While asylum seekers are not permitted to travel within the Schengen area freely, officially categorised refugees are permitted to stay in a different country in the Schengen area for 90 days. However, Farage believed that the Schengen area facilitated criminals and terrorists entering the UK. In the aftermath of an ISIS attack at Brussels airport, Farage stated that the Schengen area facilitated, quote, the free movement of terrorists, of criminal gangs, and of Kalashnikovs, end quote. Former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove, agreed with Farage. Brexit would bring 2 potentially important security gains: the ability to dump the European Convention on Human Rights, and more importantly, greater control over immigration from the European Union. However, by December 2015, only 7 months before the referendum, 6 EU countries were reported to not comply with the Schengen area, one of which was the United Kingdom. Now, whilst this is a crazy lie you'd think he'd get called on for, it's more likely that he was referring to the EU's freedom of movement policy, which allowed EU citizens, and exclusively EU citizens, to live, work, or study in other EU country without a visa. However, it required finding work or somewhere to study after a 90-day period, or if you could prove that you had the money to support yourself. There's also the Dublin Regulation, which I believe he's referencing when he says open borders sometimes, in which when an asylum seeker arrives in the EU, the first country of entry is responsible for looking after the individual. It also doesn't require an asylum seeker to claim asylum in the country of first entry until they leave the country of first entry to somewhere outside the EU, which they're allowed to do. It's no longer that country's responsibility, which is obviously only an issue if they aren't in the EU, because then you can't send them back to the country of first entry. Nigel? Farage's anti-immigration rhetoric appeared to have struck a chord. Under his leadership, despite only gaining one seat in Parliament, their share of the vote in the general elections increased from 2.8% of the vote in 2005, with around 600,000 votes, to almost 13.15% by 2015, with almost 4 million votes. Not only that, but their results in local elections also grew. In 2005, UKIP had no councillors, but by 2015, that number had surged to 496 councillors and had managed to gain control over Thanet District Council. In the European Parliament, UKIP's seat shares grew from the 3 seats in the 1999 election where he was elected, to 12 seats by 2004, to 24 seats by 2014, making UKIP the largest British party in the European Parliament. However, by 2018, Alan Sked wrote an article in The Guardian, where he stated that, "As its founder, I can only suggest that it should now dissolve itself. There may be a need for a party to hold the Tories to account of Brexit, but that is not UKIP. It now lacks all political credibility and provokes laughter rather than sympathy. It is high time, therefore, for it to disappear." Unlike Nick Griffin or Enoch Powell, Farage was always desperate to be liked, and, crucially, expected to be. He will, in almost all circumstances, back himself to bluster his way out of trouble, and studiously avoids any circumstances where he might not. Both Farage and Trump thrive on the failure of unsympathetic political journalists to recalibrate for their deliberate dilution of common decency and even truth itself. The established checks and balances were simply unprepared for how far these men would go. The anti-immigration rhetoric of Farage and UKIP really began to hit its stride in 2015, when the Middle East decided to blow the fuck up.
No external party has anything to do with the future of Syria, with the constitution or president or anything like this. No, we're not going to discuss it with them. This is the Syrian issue. Whenever the Syrian people want to change their president, it should be changed right away.
In 2015, over 1 million asylum seekers fled their home countries to take refuge in European countries. The active civil war in Syria had escalated due to the deployment of Russian troops on the ground in the summer and a mass airstrike operation beginning in September. Whilst Russia claimed they were attacking ISIS, they were also bombing the Western-backed rebels too, in an effort to only assist the dictatorial Syrian president Bashar al-Assad and secure his power. The establishment of the Afghan National Unity Government was countered by a massive spring offensive by the Taliban, in which civilians and humanitarian actors were intentionally targeted. Outside the Middle East, many young Kosovans unable to find work should instead to migrate elsewhere in search of work. Kosovan youth unemployment rates weren't the worst in the Balkans, but 6 out of every 10 young Kosovans were still unable to find work. Whilst during the Yugoslavian era, Kosovo was still undeveloped and largely reliant on agriculture, the war that Yugoslavia waged against them did not help them, to put it lightly, meaning many of these perceived economic migrants were more a product of oppression by the Yugoslavian government and later the 1998 war. According to the European Asylum Support Office, now known as the European Agency for Asylum, only 6% of the migrants that came to Europe during the crisis were from Kosovo or Albania. Farage continued to make speeches in Parliament, however, declaring the majority of people coming were economic migrants.
The majority that are coming are economic migrants. In addition, we see, as I warned earlier, evidence that ISIS are now using this route to put their jihadists on European soil. We must be mad to take this risk with the cohesion of our societies. If we want to help genuine refugees, if we want to protect our societies, if we want to stop the criminal trafficking gangs from benefiting as they are, we must stop the boats coming as the Australians did, and then we can assess who qualifies for refugee status.
For the record, ISIS High Command did in fact send ISIS militants to Europe so far, so once isn't telling a massive, easily disproven lie, but it is frankly impossible to determine how many. An ISIS commander was interviewed, during which he said, "We have sent many operatives to Europe with the refugees. Some of our brothers have fulfilled their mission, but others are still waiting to be activated." However, due to the functional collapse of ISIS in 2019, it is highly unlikely that these alleged terror cells will ever be activated. It's like small groups of individuals outside of control of a now much more weakened ISIS. Some of the MI5 has stated themselves. A Europol report suggests that ISIS intentionally sent militants over with the migrants in order to inflame anti-immigration sentiments in Europe and divide the EU. And unfortunately, it worked. The German policy headed by Chancellor Angela Merkel has led to much anti-migrant sentiment and the subsequent rise of the far-right party, Alternative for Deutschland. As of recording this, in March 2026, they are the current opposition to the CDU and SDP coalition in the Bundestag. A similar thing happened in France with the French far-right party, the National Rally, making its presence known, which currently holds 120 out of the 577 seats in the National Assembly. Despite being the largest party in the National Assembly, they are currently in opposition due to a coalition of centrist parliamentary groups. And, most importantly, in the UK, opinion polls were swaying. As the refugee crisis continued, some polls suggested lean towards remaining in the European Union. However, some suggested a lean towards the side of leave. With the Tory party actively hemorrhaging councillors and voters to UKIP and mounting pressure from the media, the Tory party leader and incumbent Prime Minister felt he had no choice but to call for a national referendum. This man was David Cameron.
Do you think people could still have you as Prime Minister if we vote to leave?
Yes, because what's on the ballot paper on the 23rd of June is, do we want to stay in the European Union or do we want to leave the European Union?
But it means they would have decided against your judgment on the economy and crucial issues like immigration.
But of course, it's my judgment and my manifesto that said we're going to hold this renegotiation, we're going to have a referendum, and that's and then we accept the instructions of the British people.
Does it not undermine your position?
Well, I think it's important people know the government is not impartial.
David Cameron, an Eton-Oxford graduate and alleged dead pig fucker, was elected to Parliament in 2001, having previously served in the Conservative Research Department under Thatcher and Major. Seen as the Tories' answer to Tony Blair, he won the Conservative leadership in 2005 before being elected Prime Minister in 2010, defeating the incumbent Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Due to the hung Parliament, which means that no party gained the required 326 seats to form a majority government, Cameron formed a coalition with the Liberal Democrats led by Nick Clegg. In 2011, the coalition passed a bill called the Fixed Term Parliament Act 2011, which necessitated that Parliament be dissolved at least every 5 years in order to call another general election, something that was only largely customary before. This meant that by 2015 another election wasn't necessitated. Our main candidates still consist of Cameron for the Tories, Clegg for the Lib Dems, and newcomer Ed Miliband for Labour. Just to briefly mention Ed Miliband, because he will never come up again, he largely branded himself around the idea called One Nation Labour, whatever the fuck that means, which attempted to distance itself from centrist New Labour for obvious reasons, but it also didn't want to go so far left as the old leftist Labour such as Wilson and Attlee. You know, the ones who built the NHS, functioned, eliminated unemployment, and stopped the Cold War from escalating into the destruction of all humankind. Because he never wanted to be like them. Cameron largely ran his 2015 campaign on holding a Brexit referendum. Whilst the Mayor of London at the time, who we'll get to later, was in the Leave camp and Cameron was a Remainer, there was much infighting in the party, which merely led to more councils hemorrhaging to UKIP. Eventually, Cameron did end up winning the 2015 election. The coalition, however, collapsed, as the Lib Dems compromised many of their policies in the coalition and were lynched electorally because of it. Meanwhile, due to the catastrophic results, Miliband resigned as the Labour leader, triggering a Labour leadership election. One man who came to the forefront was Jeremy Corbyn, a very out-and-about socialist, which contrasts with the party's shift to centre since 1994. Despite distrust from many high-ranking members of the party, Corbyn won it in a landslide, elected in a bigger majority than Blair. Corbyn was very flippant on his views on Brexit, having initially been opposed during the EEC in 1975, but had gradually shifted his stance in favour of remaining in the EU by the time he became leader, most likely as this was the popular stance amongst the party. This meant that Cameron was, politically speaking, fucked. I imagine Cameron was largely relying on the Lib Dems in order to secure a Remain vote. However, considering that Lib Dems have been voted into oblivion, I don't imagine that was an option on the table anymore. And I hardly think Cameron was going to liaise with the guy who had over 2,500 words of apocalyptic Orwellian fanfiction written about him by the Mail on Sunday. That's real, go and fucking read it, it's crazy, let me get it up. The night sky over London was thick with choking black smog, but in the hellish glow of flames rising from a myriad burning buildings, the rioters, looters, and demonstrators fighting on the city streets. Just make out the United Nations helicopter taking Jeremy Corbyn away from Downing Street to his retirement cottage in Ireland. You better not, with rising black smog, you better not tell them who's regulating our fucking trees. Jesus Christ. However, regardless, this was too big of a promise not to keep, and on June 23rd, 2016, the referendum was held.
There we are. That is now statistically, mathematically there, that the Leave campaign have won, and we're expecting at the end of the count 52% for Leave, 48% for Remain.
Leave won by a margin of less than 4%. I think it's important to analyse why this happened. Not why people voted Leave, I think the last 15 odd minutes has summarised that relatively well, but rather why did Cameron cause referendum? Because, realistically, it's not a courtesy that UKIP would have extended. They simply would have just left the EU. Why did Cameron simply just choose not to? According to Professor Tim Bale, University of London, he postulates the following. Cameron chose to commit to a vote, not because the country's population was clamouring for one, but because a significant minority of his own MPs, made them frustrated by the constraints of coalition, were demanding that he do so. Some because they feared that UKIP would cost them their seat, or the seats of too many of their colleagues, at the next election. Some because they wanted out of the European Union, and were more than happy to leverage that fear for their advantage. David Cameron lost the referendum for a whole host of reasons. For one thing, the deal he negotiated was too complex, and too much of a contrast with what he had earlier promised. For another, he underestimated how much of a role immigration would play in the debate and how willing Conservatives in the Leave campaign would be to tap into concerns of identity conservatives on the issue. Cameron also underestimated the extent to which the Leave campaign would prove able to mobilise its supporters to turn out and vote, even people who didn't normally bother. Conversely, he overestimated the willingness of the Eurosceptic leader of opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, to help the Remain campaign win over traditional voters. He also overestimated the extent to which voters would be swayed by the economic arguments against withdrawal, either because the economy wasn't delivering from them anyway, or because they believed they were sufficiently comfortably off to endure the potential downsides of leaving the EU. Hoping and believing that Remain would win, Cameron was so anxious about putting the Conservative Party back together again after the campaign that he pulled his punches when it came to criticising Tories on the Leave side, refusing again and again to fight fire with fire. Cameron had a bold task ahead of him. Democracy had spoken, and he had to do what the people wanted. It was going to be a hard slog, but he knew what he had to do.
But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
To put it bluntly, Cameron lit the fuse, panicked, and then immediately ran away, which meant that the biggest constitutional changes in modern British history was now being handled by two people who didn't actually want it. May in government and Corbyn in opposition. And if trying to work out how Brexit went so catastrophically wrong, we probably shouldn't ignore the man whose job it was to stop it. Jeremy Corbyn had been a Member of Parliament since 1983 for Islington North in London, a seat he has held for over 40 years. Throughout the 1960s, 70s and 80s, he campaigned for nuclear disarmament, protesting against military dictatorship in Brazil, and was openly opposed to American intervention in the Vietnam War. During his long career as a backbencher, where he advocated for LGBTQ rights, opposed South African apartheid, and supported the 1984 miners' strike, he was very involved in talks regarding the ongoing troubles and situation in Northern Ireland. Specifically, he maintained regular contact with the leader of the Democratic Socialist Irish Republican Party, Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams. While Sinn Féin is not, as many people claim, the political wing of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, or PIRA, they did associate with them due to their shared ideology, as they were a large force in the War of Irish Independence in 1922 and actively worked with the original IRA. Though Sinn Féin and the largest renditions of the IRA, that being the original IRA and the PIRA, were formally separate, they were closely linked in leadership and strategy, claims supported by the British government, but denied by Sinn Féin and Adams, especially in regards to rumours that party heads were former members of the IRA Army Council. There was before the IRA bomber confirmed that Adams was a leading figure of the organisation. I wrote that ages ago. Felt zero need to change it. It was going to happen eventually. By the time that Corbyn got involved in the peace process by the late 80s and 90s, Adams had begun using the party to move more towards peace in the region. Corbyn supported dialogue with Sinn Féin long before it was mainstream, but was not a principal negotiator of the Good Friday Agreement, nor did he support the actions of the PIRA. However, his early advocacy of political engagement reflected a wider movement towards dialogue that was later formalised under the Labour government in 1997, leading to the agreement and the end of most paramilitary violence. However, Corbyn still vocally opposed Blair's leadership, which pulled the party from the left to the centre during his 13 years running the party. As a notable anti-war advocate, he naturally opposed much of the actions that Blair's government took in regards to Iraq especially.
Thousands more deaths in Iraq will not make things right. It will set off a spiral of conflict, of hate, of misery, of desperation that will fuel the wars, the conflict, the terrorism, the depression and the misery of future generations.
This led to him being a vocal voice in the leftist faction of the party, but not taken too particularly seriously by main centrist heads of the party, such as Blair, Brown, and eventually Keir Starmer.
The first thing it says is the moronic MPs who nominated Jeremy Corbyn to have a debate.
It includes John Crudders,
need
though.
their heads felt. They need their heads felt. They should be ashamed of themselves.
However, by the time that Miliband resigned as leader in 2015, some high-ranking members of the party thought that, for shits and giggles, it would be funny to appoint Corbyn as a candidate for the leadership election. Did they expect him to win? No. Do they think it would help them appeal to more working class and leftist members, and just have a bit of a more socialist variety on the stage? Yes. The other candidates were very establishment-centred to soft left party members such as Andy Burnham, Yvette Cooper, and Liz Kendall, all of whom held positions in government from 1997 to 2010, or in shadow government since. Many thought that these three would absolutely wipe the floor with Corbyn, a prior known Eurosceptic, and could actually oppose or at least soften Brexit, hoping to present Corbyn as a somewhat ridiculous radical alternative, a sort of way to say, just trust the pros with this one. What I did anticipate, however, was that people might have actually liked what Corbyn had to say, as he was openly anti-war, anti-austerity, and anti-being almost settler like the Tories in their attitude towards poor people, even despite the attempts of some of Labour's higher staff to intentionally block people from voting for him in the leadership elections. Corbyn won 59.5% of the vote in 2015, larger than Blair's 57% in 1994. Immediately, the right went into panic mode. This obviously leftist and popular leader threatened so much of their way of life that multiple news outlets, especially on the right, began printing straight-up lies, misinformation, and disinformation about Corbyn's positions, especially in the lead-up to the 2017 election. A study by London School of Economics in July 2016 found that approximately 75% of news articles about Corbyn during his first 5 months in leadership were either phrased antagonistically, distorted, or failed to represent any of his actual views. Mind you, this is before the BBC edited the image of Corbyn to make him look like a feature in a Soviet propaganda piece in 2018 for the Newsnight background. These beliefs included scrapping tuition fees, addressing public sector pay, making housing more affordable, and providing school students with free lunches, all of which was fully budgeted and accounted for. I fucking know, right? However, Corbyn was not all entirely misrepresented. His Brexit policy was, to put it lightly, functionally non-existent. The March 2019 campaign, Corbyn wasn't a massive Brexit campaigner, and chose to rather focus on the issues of his leadership campaign, not pushing for a second referendum and adopting a wait-and-see approach, which allowed the Tories to gain significantly more ground in 2019. This was partially because of Labour infighting. Some wanted to just accept defeat, some wanted to negotiate a soft Brexit, whilst others, like Corbyn, were backing a second referendum. This lack of consensus held back a clear and effective Remain campaign, whilst also giving massive airtime for Leave hardliners such as Johnson and Farage. Whilst Cameron, as previously mentioned, didn't want to work with a man who the Sunday Times compared to Mao Zedong because he rode a bike, Corbyn was equally opposed to working with Cameron, whose austerity policies he believed had gutted public services and left the country in a significantly worse state when he came to power in 2010. This allowed the Leave campaign to get a significantly more clear message out there, whilst the Remainers in Labour, which is a relatively sizable chunk of the upper echelons, were left discontent with Corbyn's inaction. After the referendum vote, a vote of no confidence was put forward in Corbyn's leadership in the party. This was headed by Hilary Benn.
It is now time for us to do our bit in Syria, and that is why I ask my colleagues to vote for this motion tonight.
Hilary Benn, son of major socialist Labour figure Tony Benn and the fourth in a line of MPs in his family, was the Shadow Foreign Secretary under Corbyn. He'd been elected to Parliament in a by-election in 1999, describing himself as, quote, a Ben, but not a Bennite. Under Blair, he was appointed as Secretary of State for International Development, where he assisted in debt reliefs for poor countries like the G8, reduced foreign poverties, whilst increasing health and opposed foreign corrupt governments. He was appointed Shadow Secretary for the Environment under Miliband, before being appointed Shadow Foreign Secretary by Harriet Harman's interim Shadow Cabinet, a position he maintained under Corbyn. Benn was strongly pro-EU, something that meant he and Corbyn butted heads consistently over Brexit. Benn believed that Corbyn, as Labour leader, was supposed to be leading the charge against it, but his Eurosceptic instincts got in the way of that. Instead of just running a Remain campaign and hoping that Corbyn may tag along later, Benn believed that Corbyn would be ineffective as national leader, a belief that was backed by many MPs of the party who deemed Corbyn unelectable, so began focusing much of Labour's efforts into ousting Corbyn instead of on a Remain campaign. After the referendum, Benn publicly called for Corbyn to resign as Labour leader.
I think Jeremy's position is now untenable, and being the decent man that he is, I hope he will recognise that and step down, because we need a Labour Party that can hold the government to account. We need to be trying to win and gain support instead of losing it, which is what we face as long as Jeremy remains leader. And I think people in the country, especially those who voted to leave in the referendum, they want to see a Labour Party that is going to listen to their concerns and help the country to manage our way through the big changes that we are now facing. And I think it's time for him to go.
After these statements were made, Benn was quickly sacked as Shadow Foreign Secretary. Because of this, 20 Shadow Cabinet ministers resigned for the next 2 days, causing the Parliamentary Labour Party to be thrust into an outright revolt against Corbyn. The anti-Corbyn PLP bloc, headed by Benn, argued that Corbyn was unfit to be potential PM, electorally disastrous, and failed to lead an effective Remain campaign. On June 28, 2016, Labour MPs called a vote of confidence in Corbyn's leadership. Whilst it did pass the MPs and demonstrate the PLP didn't support Corbyn, it functionally was useless. Corbyn refused to resign, as he believed he had a democratic mandate by party members to lead, and the MPs' opinions were irrelevant. The PLP then began to force leadership challenges at Angela Eagle, who had served a multitude of positions in government under Blair and Brown and shadow positions under Miliband and Corbyn. Mind you, this is the same Angela Eagle who said that Corbyn was, quote, up and down the country pursuing an itinerary that made a 25-year-old tired regarding his Remain campaign, and that was suddenly being shafted from headlines in favour of the Conservative infighting and other right-wing Leave views. In challenging his leadership, Shayton left at him that too many of our supporters were taken in by right-wing arguments, and I believe this happened in part because under your leadership, the case to remain in the EU was made with half-hearted ambivalence. So which one is it? Is he campaigning harder than a 25-year-old, and it wasn't reported on, or did he not campaign at all? Make up your fucking mind. No matter what Eagle thought of Corbyn, she truly proved her point in the unelectability of Corbyn by stepping down after 8 days. She was then replaced by Owen Smith. Determined to prove how unelectable and weird Corbyn was, the leadership election went ahead, leading to Corbyn winning an even bigger landslide than last time. This naturally frustrated the PLP, the unelectable weirdo who was still in power because people kept electing him. So while Labour MPs were busy trying to decapitate their own leader, Brexit didn't politely pause and wait for them to finish. Farage lit the match, Cameron fanned the flames, and as the country started to burn, Labour began fighting each other over who should hold the hose. Cameron ran for the hills and left a different Tory to turn Leave into an actual policy. Unfortunately for the country, their son was Theresa May. Theresa May, another Oxford graduate, was a councillor for the London Borough of Merton before being elected to MP for Maidenhead in 1997. She served a multitude of positions in shadow cabinets in 2010, during which time she was also appointed the first female chair in the Conservative Party. Upon Conservative victory in 2010, she became a Home Secretary, a position in which she adamantly opposed Brexit.
And I genuinely believe, from everything I've seen over the last 6 years as Home Secretary, that we would be more secure and safer inside the European Union.
Once Cameron resigned, she became the leader of the Conservative Party by July 13th. She now had a Herculean task ahead of her. She, as a Remainer, had to now get a Brexit deal to benefit the people of Britain and not entirely sour our relations with the EU. She eventually began moving forward the process by March 2017, before almost immediately calling another general election.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June.
This is very surprising, as in September 2016, she said she wouldn't call another election until the mandated one in 2020. What she stated was that, by calling the snap election, it would allow the Tories in Parliament to stabilise their position or to guarantee Brexit by creating a stronger Tory majority in Parliament. However, if that was her reason, I'm not entirely convinced she would have run the campaign the way she did. For one thing, she couldn't even bother to show up at the leaders' debate. If you can't tell, this isn't Theresa May, this is Home Secretary Amber Rudd. Not only that, but May also started proposing incredibly controversial policies.
There's also the problem of what critics are calling the dementia tax. The manifesto lays out that the elderly must pay for their own care if they have savings and property worth more than £100,000. In other words, if they own a house, they'll probably have to sell it to pay for the care they'll need. Although if they don't want to lose their home for some reason, the payment can be deferred until after they die. How generous.
At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if the Tories were intentionally trying to throw the election by just saying bullshit. And then once Brexit became Labour's problem and not theirs, they could try and make a bigger comeback once Corbyn inevitably failed in trying to get a good Brexit. And that's exactly what happened. By the time the election came around, the result was a hung parliament again. The Tories lost 13 seats while Labour gained 30, and the Tories were ahead of Labour by less than 1 million votes, despite the party trying to hang itself by trying to suppose the most popular leader since Blair. However, this meant that May was in an even worse position than before. She eventually got backing from the Democratic Unionist Party to form a majority that would actually get bills passed. This, however, meant that the party position was more unstable than before. So I think that worked out great. Good job, Theresa. May kept trying to campaign for a soft Brexit, which entailed temporary customs alignment and regulatory cooperation, with the option of a second referendum to confirm that was what the British people still wanted, something that mirrored Corbyn's plan. However, one of the main issues was Northern Ireland, which stated that there would be no physical border checks on the Irish border. This is due to the Good Friday Agreement, which necessitated over an Irish border in order to ensure peace in the region. And we don't want to go back to that, because last time we had peace in the region, they tried to blow up the Prime Minister. We don't really want that, do we? All opposition parties, most of which are hardline Remainers, voted down the deal, whilst 118 Tories, many of whom wanted a hard Brexit, also voted down the deal. At this point, May realised she physically could not get her deal through Parliament, leading to her resigning by July of 2019.
But it is now clear to me that it is in the best interests of the country for a new Prime Minister to lead that effort. So I am today announcing that I will resign as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party on Friday the 7th of June, so that a successor can be chosen. I will shortly leave the job that it has been the honour of my life to hold. The second female Prime Minister, but certainly not the last. I do so with no ill will, but with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
This means we are now on our third Tory Prime Minister since they were voted into government, and we have passed the initial Brexit deadline. I wonder who the new leader might be. Would it be a strong, competent Prime Minister who could effectively deliver a Brexit to benefit the British people?
Invest. Hands up anyone who's been to Peppa Pig World. Not enough. I was a bit hazy what I would find at Peppa Pig World, but I loved it. And Peppa Pig World is very much my kind of place. It has very safe streets, discipline in schools, heavy emphasis on new mass transit systems, I notice, even if they're a bit stereotypical about Daddy Pig.
Oh, fuck.
Now, I know you're a very busy man, but when was the last time you cooked and what did you make?
How are you? Nice to see you. The last time I cooked was last night, and I made steak and oven chips, which were very good.
Alexander Boris de Boris Johnson was spat out of a hellhole in Manhattan in 1964, and the express purpose given to him by the devil himself to destroy the British economy. That's not entirely fair. Johnson, who went to Eton with Cameron and also went to Oxford, was a Member of Parliament for Henley from 2001 to 2008, when he resigned to focus on his duties as Mayor of London. During this time in Parliament, he had written articles for many right-wing news outlets such as The Telegraph and The Spectator, the latter of which was appointed editor. He was re-elected to Parliament in 2015 and served both positions of MP and Mayor of London simultaneously for a year. Johnson was by far the biggest voice in the Conservative Party in favour of Brexit. The most infamous part of his campaign was a bus that stated, "We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead. Let's take back control." This figure was cooked up by Leave campaign leader Dominic Cummings, who later served as chief advisor to Johnson, and totals approximately £18 billion out annually. This figure is, to put it lightly, bullshit. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has called this number, quote, "clearly absurd," end quote, and the number is more accurately £8 billion annually, whilst also stating that the Leave vote would cost the country anywhere between £20 and £40 billion. The Guardian further stated that the figure fails to take into account the amount of money sent from the EU back to our public sector, which is approximately £4.4 billion in 2015, as well as private sector support, which is an additional £1 billion. Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland, openly called out Johnson on this lie in a TV debate alongside Eagle and Rudd.
It's a bit rich to hear the man who used to say we should be charged for using the NHS pretend that he's now the defender of the NHS. I am staggered that Boris Johnson is standing here tonight still defending this £350 million a week figure. It's a scandal that that's still emblazoned across the campaign bus because it's an absolute whopper.
The moment Cameron resigned, the pledge to spend £350 million extra a week on the NHS was dropped entirely. When US President Barack Obama stated that it would be more beneficial for the UK to remain in the EU, Johnson recalled when Obama relocated the bus to Winston Churchill from the Oval Office to elsewhere in the White House, stating that the removal, quote, was a symbol of the part Kenyan president's ancestral dislike of the British Empire, of which Churchill had been such a fervent defender. Jesus Christ. You made me understand why it was so controversial when, under May's government, he was appointed as Foreign Secretary. However, it is still largely believed that, considering the new positions of Brexit Secretary and International Trade Secretary, functionally turning the Foreign Secretary into nothing more than a figurehead, this was really done to keep Johnson away from home and prevent a hard Brexit backbench rebellion. However, he still found a way. He continued to promote the line on the side of the bus, which colleagues in May's cabinet condemned. He then also stated that all trade to Northern Ireland should be blocked. When asked about the impact that the blocking of all trade to the EU and how it would impact UK businesses, he reportedly said, "Fuck business." The party of private enterprise, everyone. Eventually, due to his opposition to May's Brexit plan that he claimed would make Britain head, quote, towards the status of a colony, end quote, Johnson resigned as Foreign Secretary in 2018 and was replaced by Remainer Jeremy Hunt. By the time of May's resignation, he had put himself forward as a leading candidate in the Leave camp. His slogan, "Get Brexit Done," was a staple of his leadership campaign, exploiting the tactics of populists before him such as Farage, Donald Trump, and Viktor Orban. He presents himself as a candidate willing to fight the bureaucratic elites of Parliament, who are unwilling to do the people's will. One of his most controversial policies was to enforce a no-deal Brexit, in which Britain would leave the EU without any sort of economic partnership that had been promised throughout the referendum campaign. He also stated that he wanted to tighten the Irish border by removing May's proposed backstop. As Leave figures such as Michael Gove backed out in favour of Johnson, he absolutely annihilated Remain competition such as Rory Stewart, leading to a landslide victory against Hunt. I had discovered that he did not understand his own Brexit proposals and did not care. Worse, I had learned that he was allying himself with the most divisive force in the Conservative Party and in British politics. This shocked me more profoundly than anything that had preceded it. 9 years in politics had already been a dismal insight into the lack of seriousness in British politics. To put an egotistical chancer like Johnson into the heart of a system that was already losing its dignity, restraint and seriousness was to invite catastrophe. Upon his election, he immediately got to work. On August 28th, he announced he would prorogue Parliament from September 14th to October 14th, a matter of weeks just before his proposed Brexit deadline on October 31st. Just before the proroguement took effect, Benn led the charge in a bipartisan coalition bill they managed to shove through. Called the Benn Act, it forced the government to get a deal regarding Brexit. Following this, Johnson suspended 21 Conservative MPs for defying the party whip and backing the bill. The Queen approved the proroguement of Parliament due to the advice that Johnson's team had given to the Privy Council. But they immediately hit a bump. On September 11th, the Scottish Inner House of the Court ruled that his suspension of Parliament was unlawful. On September 24th, the British Supreme Court validated this claim through unanimous ruling stating the advice given to the Queen was unlawful and that Parliament was permitted to sit the next day. On September 25th, Parliament erupted into chaos. The Attorney General Geoffrey Cox vehemently defended the government's position. You won't be mistaken for thinking Brian Blessed travelled back in time to Victorian Parliament due to the way his speech was conducted.
This Parliament is a dead Parliament. It should no longer sit. It has no moral right to sit on these green benches. They could vote no confidence at any time, but they're too cowardly. They could agree to a motion to allow this House to dissolve, but they're too cowardly. This Parliament should have the courage to face the electorate, but it won't. It won't, because so many of them are really all about preventing us leaving the European Union at all. The time is coming, Mr. Speaker, when even these turkeys won't be able to prevent Christmas.
Meanwhile, Labour MPs decried that the tone of the debate regarding Brexit was becoming increasingly toxic. When MP Paula Sheriff stepped forward, she called out Boris on his referral to the Benn Act as a surrender. She backdropped this with the murder of Labour MP Joe Cox 3 years prior. According to The Guardian, the assassin targeted Joe Cox only a few weeks before the referendum due to her pro-EU and pro-immigration stances, viewing her as a traitor to white people. Her name was invoked by Sheriff that day, who served the next-door constituency from Cox.
That we should not resort to using offensive, dangerous or inflammatory language for legislation that we do not like. And we stand here, Mr. Speaker, under the shield of our departed friend, with many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words, surrender act, betrayal, traitor. So I would be interested in hearing his opinion. He should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life. Because the reality is, this is a bill.
Many regard this as the day that Brexit broke Parliament. However, Johnson still had one trick up his sleeve. As Parliament on both sides of the aisle came to the consensus that Brexit was becoming a drag and a waste of their time, Johnson was permitted to call a general election for December of 2019. Johnson further built his position on getting Brexit done, as Corbyn continued to campaign on solely domestic issues. Much like Parliament, people were also getting tired of Brexit. The promise to get Brexit done finally clearly resonated, leading to a landslide victory of the Tories, their greatest majority since Thatcher, giving them the mandate they needed to complete Brexit. Corbyn, after overseeing Labour's worst defeat since 1935, resigned the leadership. Brexit was eventually completed by January 31st, 2020. The abolition of an open trade agreement came just in time for a global pandemic. A study from the National Bureau of Economic Research based out of Massachusetts has stated the following regarding Brexit's impact. We estimate that by 2025, the Brexit process has reduced UK GDP by 6% to 8%, investment by 12% to 18%, employment by 3% to 4%, and productivity by 3% to 4%. We identify four main channels which Brexit has affected the UK economy. First, the UK's decision to leave the EU generates a persistent increase in uncertainty, weighing on investment in particular. Second, investment and employment growth were affected by lower expected demands for goods and services. Third, productivity growth within firms was affected by lower innovation and IT investment, and by management time and resources being used to prepare for Brexit. Finally, productivity growth between firms was reduced as the more productive internationally exposed firms were more negatively impacted. I have worked for the Conservative Party for the last 70 years. I have followed the inspiration of Churchill, Macmillan, Heath, and Thatcher, who gave Britain a leading position in one of the power blocks in the 21st century. I have seen that overturned by a cynical, exploitative combination of premises led by Boris Johnson. He won a large majority on the slogan "Get Brexit Done." Yet here we are, years later, when the criticism, even from its most fanatical supporters like Nigel Farage, is that Brexit has failed. No doubt he will go out into the world and make huge sums of money, writing history as he thinks it was conducted, but it will have little to do with the reality of the mess he has left behind. He can continue to cause damage to the party. He has done so conspicuously in recent years, because he retains a following in the country. That will be exploited by his friends in the popular press. But his real legacy is Brexit, the biggest historic mistake this country has made in peacetime. So, what now? The British economy is objectively worse now due to the impacts of Brexit, and no leader will even consider the opportunity to undo the impacts of this catastrophic mess. Even the idea of rejoining the customs union is laughed at.
I know members opposite are relieved. They are finally allowed to say the Conservatives' Brexit deal is a disaster. Given we still have the highest inflation in the G7, it mustn't be a smokescreen to raise taxes on ordinary people.
Mr. Speaker, it must be a call to action. So will the Prime Minister act now to repair the Brexit damage by negotiating a new UK-EU customs union to boost Britain's trade and grow our economy?
No, I don't think that's the way forward. What we've done is to have a much closer relationship with the EU, recognising the damage done by the flawed Brexit deal that the party opposite negotiated. We've also struck deals with India and with the US, record investment into this country, and the fastest growing economy in the G7 in the first half of this year.
And ultimately, whose fault is it? Is it Johnson's, May's, Benn's, Corbyn's, Cameron's, Farage's? Well, no. It's the fault of referendum politics. Or, to be more exact, the entire collapse of party consensus. Labour's always been a symbol of factions in British politics, whether to unilaterally disarm or not, whether they were a force for democratic socialism or social democracy, and, rather fittingly, if they were to initially join the EU or not. However, this consensus collapsed within the Conservative Party over the course of the Brexit period. The right is now split on almost as many lines as the left is. Do we stay in the EU? Becomes, do we have a hard or soft Brexit? Do we have a hard or soft Brexit? Becomes, do we leave the European Convention on Human Rights? Do we leave the European Convention on Human Rights? Becomes, do we build an English ethno-state?
If that means millions go, then millions go.
Farage himself is an example of this splitting. He joined UKIP after his membership in the Conservative Party and then founded the Brexit Party, now Reform UK, as a splinter from UKIP. Now 2 ex-Reform members have made their own political parties, Advance UK and Restore Britain, both of which are further right than Reform UK. There are so many political options in the UK, and in a first-past-the-post system, I'm not entirely convinced that's a good thing. This one tweet I saw recently has really stuck with me, and it truly ties up what I now think everyone's opinion on Brexit is. Brexit was really just about getting all the bad sides of being in Europe, and nothing good.